Cities Skylines 2 first released in early access. Cities Skylines 2 released in October of 23. And much has changed since then in what has been a very turbulent time. Let's break it down. Dissect Cities 2. Is it good now? Is it worth it? Is it working? Let's discuss. Let's start with a quick whirlwind overview of how we got here. So Cities Skylines 2 released on the 24th of October 2023, roughly 20 weeks at the time of recording. And in those 20 weeks, the patches have almost exclusively focused on bug fixes, alongside some performance improvements and tweaks, though the impactfulness of those seems to depend on who you're talking to. Myself, I haven't noticed a massive difference. The patches focusing on bug fixes have improved the game, though with no new significant features added, there are still problems to fix, both in terms of that variety and the state of the simulation and the bugs within it. We'll return to that a little bit more slightly later in the video, but first, the other thing we should consider when thinking about the state of Cities 2 is how's the community responded? And you'll know as well as I do, with much negativity, with much fear and justified criticism, and some positive enjoyment as well. It's been a mixed bag, but it was certainly a rough launch. No doubt about that. And if we turn to active player count numbers, granted just using Steam as our sample size, you can see that. Cities Skylines 2's player count has been gradually, slowly declining in recent weeks. And unfortunately, this is the tail end of what is an overwhelming and overarching theme, and in Cities' defense, not an all that uncommon one. You would expect games to be hyped and have loads of players at launch, but still quite a negative trend. Straight down and across, with a gradual decline. And the news gets worse when we start to compare it to its predecessor, Cities Skylines 1, which at the time of recording this video has seen a trend of being more popular than Cities Skylines 2. And that gap in player numbers on Steam seems to be widening. Some, of course, quite important sort of other things to note here. Firstly, people will likely rightly point out that this is just Steam. Cities Skylines 2 is available on Game Pass, where people can play it with a much lower barrier to entry in terms of price. It's basically free if you were already paying for the subscription, that is. But of course, on the flip side, Cities Skylines 2 isn't on console, whereas 1 is. So yes, there are player counts that aren't captured. Yes, this is just using Steam. I don't claim it to be the perfect exemplar, the ultimate depiction. However, of course, that's not the focus of this video, at least not by itself. Let's talk about what explicitly has gone wrong and what the team are focusing on next. We're talking delays in Cities 2. Now, of course, Cities 2 was itself delayed. Well, at least I feel bad even saying that, because of course it is the console version that has ultimately been the most delayed. We released the game on PC, they say, but not yet console. And as far as we know, it's still just coming soon, with fairly vague, open-ended, honestly just kind of fluffy replies to most questions about when we can expect to see the game on console. And I think that people are right when they say, given the difficulties in this game's performance, particularly once you get to that larger city size, and of course it will depend on your own individual system, but in my opinion, once you start getting to 6 figures, 100,000 people, especially once you start to cross over 200, 250,000, you're basically watching a PowerPoint slide, particularly if you're building or placing things down. I mean, you can see by the footage that I'm playing right now, it is not great on what is a high-end system with a processor, the highest end only a year and a half old, and the latest NVIDIA graphics card, and it struggles here. It really struggles. And if there's work to be done here, then maybe the consoles are going to struggle too. I mean, they're pretty old and inferior, though I would think that they'd have some upside of at least being universal. If you're developing for one person's PS5, you're developing for all PS5s. The next item in an unfortunately pretty long list of delays was the post-release content. Two different points to make here. The first one, the largely paid DLC, the stuff that actually came with the game if you ordered the Ultimate Edition. Of course, we had instant access to the San Francisco set, basically the Golden Gate Bridge, but all of the rest of this stuff was delayed. Beachfront properties and a radio station expected, frankly, any day now. It wouldn't surprise me if this was being pushed back again. And then in Q2 of 2024, similarly delayed by around 3 months from the initial expectation, some creator packs, finally. Different architecture, urban promenades, and keys inside of the bridges and ports expansion, bringing content to Cities Skylines 2 that, as some people will rightly point out, may have already existed in Cities 1. And I think that's one of the strongest reasons why Cities 1 is still arguably the best city builder on the market. But I'm getting ahead of myself a little bit here. There is, of course, one more big section of delays, and arguably the most important one of all, modding and everything that surrounds it. Modding is something that has been delayed numerous times. The team, Colossal Order, now refraining from putting any timeline on it at all, simply saying it will be coming soon. And we know that they'll be releasing patches as well, speaking of things that need to be added to the game, alongside these big changes. So the next time we see an update, it's likely to include modding, or some part of modding, custom maps, assets, blah, 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 in beta form. We're not expecting modding to roll out in full and out of beta until, I believe, around October 2024, which will be, coincidentally, around 1 year since Cities Skylines 2 released. So it's going to be a long road ahead for modding. It's worth mentioning Colossal Order's recent statement in their Word of the Week series, the Turbulent series that's been cancelled and brought back. We've learned how to give constructive criticism, and recently they've turned to trying to answer some of the harder questions. And while I wasn't personally massively blown away with their answers, there is some interesting stuff in here. Acknowledging all of these delays, the missing modding, the console, DLC, and issues with the game that we've discussed, they say, quote, "We'd much rather be in a different position than we're in at the moment, but we cannot change the past. We're working very hard to catch up on the missing modding support, missing platforms, the content for the Ultimate Edition, and improving the performance and fixing bugs this year. The team is divided to work on different tasks so that we're seeing progress on all fronts, and while I might not feel it's fast enough, I can assure you we are doing the best we can. Only time will tell if this is enough to turn things around." And they go on to talk about how the cadence of patches will slow down, focusing on bigger changes and some of the things that I've already discussed in this video. So our expectation is that we should see Cities Skylines 2 fix all of those issues and all of those gaps this year. They say they're working on at least improving all of that stuff. The extent to which it's implemented, of course, we'll have to wait and see. And finally, as I gently alluded to with my tongue-in-cheek introduction, I think there have been a series of mishandlings or unfortunate accidents that have occurred in and around the discussion of this game. PR misplays, if you will. Firstly, there's somewhat of a understanding that this game was falsely labeled or overhyped. I want you to think content creators in the sky, kind of glamorous, leading up to this game. And as I was going to mention earlier, but decided to mention here instead, there's also that question around the variety in Cities 2. Right after the game launched, literally just a couple of days amidst that firestorm of fury, they released a trailer showcasing that we would have buildings created by modders and creatives within the community from 8 distinctly different architectural regions of the world. Almost radio silence on that front. A big mistake. Equally, that broader hype perhaps was too far overdone, considering what was sort of dropped upon us, the kind of game that was presented, and more importantly, the state that it was in. Because as I mentioned way back many months ago, I actually really like Cities 2. I do. I like using the cinematic camera mode to film these shots for you. I like covering the updates and actually just playing the game. But it is still very flawed, of course. And we've seen a bunch of other things that weren't ideal. Those word of the week difficulties we talked about earlier, on again, off again, we'll talk to you next week. All of a sudden there's no word next week. These things could perhaps use some ironing out, but aren't really that big of a deal by themselves. You know, at the end of the day, a tweet's a tweet. I kind of think who really cares? But more broadly, I think there's also still a fairly prominent position, though perhaps not likely the majority of people, who consider that there's kind of been a lack of ownership here too, or at the very least, acknowledgement. Perhaps the studio comes across as slightly stubborn in their sort of unwavering or unwillingness to apologize to the level that people want, though having them down on their hands and knees begging, I believe, would be a step too far. Of course, there are other considerations here too, like legal liabilities that may or may not cross the mind of a CEO. So where to from here then? Let's get to the crux of the video. As I've already mentioned, I do like Cities 2, and I think that its bones are fairly solid, though it's probably missing a few still, and one or two of them could use an X-ray, because I think they're still broken. Just to really tease out that metaphor. In practical terms, the performance must be better. It must improve, particularly for larger cities. And I anticipate that older consoles and, of course, older PC systems will continue to struggle if it even arrives to them. Speaking of arriving, the delays must be mopped up too. The sooner the better. Don't get me wrong, a cyberpunk kind of situation can, I believe, and I believe it's actually fairly likely that it will play out here eventually. That's good news for someone buying in the future, but little consolation to somebody perhaps who purchased the game on launch. Some specifics: I think that the simulation needs better transparency. We need to understand what's going on. This will help quell the myths and mistruths around the state of the simulation, that it's all false, but also provide better accountability for us so that we can actually understand what's being simulated, and of course the bugs around it need to be fixed. I think that it should also potentially better reflect difficulties in planning and building a city. Am I just painting a map? Growth, far too easy. Land values, broken. And budgets pumped up by subsidies so far that you can basically get away with doing whatever you like. And finally, I think there's some missing diversity here as well. In city service building type, variety, size. In the look and feel, again, of architecture, there isn't enough. And not to go on about it too much, but where are my push bikes at? Where are the bike lanes? Come on, it's a city builder. I need them. No? I don't know. Either way, to answer another question, should I buy it now? Ultimately, that's not for me to say. It's your money, your budget. Do you buy one game a year or do you buy 100? Because that will definitely impact the outcome. But generally, I think that Cities Skylines 1 still presents a much better deal with full modding support and years worth of content inside of it. It's also likely to run better. However, I will still gravitate toward Cities 2 personally. I like that it's a bit more modern. I like the way it looks and feels when it's working. So it will ultimately be down to the individual, but I think generally, thinking about Cities 1 on a Steam sale, a wonderful discount right down to like $10 or something, I mean, it's not really a competition between the two as of right now. I think what's next will be a busy few months ahead for Colossal Order. The pressure is still very much on for them to prove themselves and to turn Cities Skylines 2 into what people expected it to be. Not necessarily 100% of those often overhyped and unrealistic expectations, but it should have modding. You should be able to build a large city, and the simulation shouldn't be fundamentally broken. Provided they can fix and improve all of those things, crucially rolling out modding, I think that by the end of 2024, the conversation and the conclusion to this video could be very different. But for now, I'm gonna leave it here. Thank you for joining me in a video more focused around my thoughts and less around the specific big news and updates inside of Cities 2. I hope you enjoyed it. I'll see you next time.